Frank survived war zones, but nothing prepared him for the silence of coming home. That silence shatters when a desperate foster kid crashes into his world and brings it back to life. Like what you're hearing? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more powerful stories that hit hard and heal deeper. The day started like every other in Frank Delaney's world, gray and quiet and precise. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but his old body knew the hour without needing to glance at the clock. He pulled the cord on the bedside lamp, scratched the stubble on his cheek, and sat on the edge of the bed until the stiffness in his knees subsided. Outside the window, the pale morning light filtered through the dying leaves of the maple tree, casting long shadows across the lawn he kept neatly trimmed. He stood slowly, made his way to the bathroom, and performed the same routine he had followed for years. Everything in his small house was in order. His towels were folded, his mugs hung on hooks in the kitchen, and the radio on the counter came alive at 600 sharp with a familiar voice delivering the local news. He never changed the station. Frank brewed his coffee without sugar or cream and drank it while leaning against the kitchen sink, staring out the window toward the backyard. There, past the patch of dead grass and the leaning fence, stood the workshop. Once it had been his sanctuary. Built with his own hands, every inch measured and cut with care, the place used to hum with the sound of drills and saws and quiet satisfaction. Now it sat in silence. A shed-sized tomb filled with dust-covered tools, unfinished projects, and the weight of years he no longer talked about. He still kept it clean, or at least free of clutter. Once a month he'd oil the hinges on the door and wipe the cobwebs off the windows. He told himself it was to keep the place from falling apart, but in truth he couldn't stand the idea of rot setting in. He'd seen too much decay in his life already. The radio droned on in the background, a soothing murmur he barely registered, as he rinsed his mug and set it on the drying rack in the exact same spot it always went. After breakfast, Frank took a slow walk around the property. He checked the gutters, inspected the side gate, and picked up a wind-blown newspaper someone else had dropped. He didn't read the papers much anymore. The headlines always looked the same, and most of what was worth knowing came from the voices on the AM dial. He paused by the workshop and placed a hand on the door. The wood was smooth, aged by time, but still sturdy. For a moment, he considered going in and working on the broken chair he'd told himself he'd fix 5 years ago, but the thought passed quickly. His shoulder had been acting up again, and the idea of lifting lumber or sanding joints seemed more chore than joy now. Inside the house, the rest of the morning passed slowly. He sat in his worn armchair and read a paperback he'd already read twice. When the radio station switched to old country music, he let it play, not minding the scratchy tunes from a past that felt closer than it should. At noon, he made himself a sandwich and cut it in half, not out of necessity but habit. For years after the war, he'd made lunch for 2 out of instinct, even when no one else was around. Sometimes he ate both halves. Sometimes he wrapped one and left it in the fridge until it went stale. Frank was not lonely in the way most people described loneliness. He had neighbors, though he rarely spoke to them, and clerks at the hardware store who knew his name but never asked much. He could go days without a real conversation and not feel the absence like a wound. What he felt was more like a hollowness, like a room stripped of furniture. You could walk through it and still function, but it wasn't a place you'd want to stay. The afternoon passed with a kind of quiet that only a house with no children could offer. The sun arced over the backyard, lighting the workshop windows with a warm gold that made the dust inside glow faintly, if anyone had been there to see it. But no one was. Frank sat at his kitchen table, a puzzle half completed in front of him. He didn't really care whether he finished it. It was something to do with his hands. Outside, a few squirrels chased each other across the fence, and a car alarm in the next block went off briefly before falling silent again. By the time evening settled, Frank had done everything he usually did and still felt like the day had passed too slowly. He cooked a small dinner, watched the first half of a Western on TV, and turned it off before the climax. He knew how it would end. They always did. Instead, he washed his plate, double-checked the locks on the doors, and turned off the lights one by one. When he stepped into his bedroom, he paused by the framed photograph on the nightstand. The photo was old and faded, the color nearly gone, but the faces were still clear. 5 men in uniform, arms slung over shoulders, standing in front of a tent in the desert. Frank's was the middle face, a little younger, a little thinner, a cigarette tucked behind his ear. He didn't touch the frame, but he looked at it for a long time before crawling into bed. Sleep didn't come quickly. It never did. He listened to the soft hum of the ceiling fan, the creak of wood settling, the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. Somewhere across the street, a door slammed. He closed his eyes and tried to focus on his breathing, slow and steady, just like the exercises the VA counselor had taught him years ago. He didn't go to the meetings anymore, but he remembered some of the things they said. Around midnight, a soft noise jolted him upright. It wasn't loud, but it didn't belong. A faint clatter, like metal brushing against metal, came from outside. He got up, barefoot, and moved through the house without turning on the lights. He'd learned long ago how to navigate in darkness. From the kitchen window, he scanned the backyard. The workshop stood in silence. He waited. There it was, again, a small scrape, like something falling against a workbench. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but instinct. He moved to the closet and pulled out the heavy flashlight with a rubber grip. Its weight felt good in his hand. Opening the back door quietly, he stepped onto the porch and listened. The air was still. A breeze rustled the branches of the maple tree, but the sound was different, deliberate, human. He moved slowly toward the workshop, the flashlight off, his boots silent on the path. As he reached the door, he saw it just a crack of light inside, flickering like someone had a phone screen lit. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and opened the door without a word. Inside, the smell of oil and old wood hit him at once, and crouched near the tool cabinet was a shape he didn't recognize. The boy turned at the sound, eyes wide, hands frozen in the act of sliding a wrench into a backpack. He looked no older than 15, clothes too thin for the cool night air, shoes scuffed and untied. His face was hard, not because it had hardened with age, but because it had learned early not to show softness. Frank stood still in the doorway, the flashlight now pointed at the ground. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, and in that charged, frozen moment, something shifted. Frank did not yell. He had been trained to react, to assess, to act when the moment called for it. But standing there in the half-lit workshop, the boy frozen like a cornered animal, Frank didn't move forward or raise his voice. He simply watched, eyes locked on the kid's trembling hands. The flashlight beam illuminated enough of his face to reveal a smudge of dirt across his cheek and a flicker of panic behind narrowed eyes. The boy clutched the wrench tighter, though it wasn't a weapon, not really. It was just something solid in his hands, something to pretend might help him escape. Frank took a slow breath, careful not to let it shake. He turned the flashlight off, letting the moonlight spill through the small window and reclaim the shadows. The boy blinked, surprised, maybe thrown off by the lack of fury, the absence of sirens or shouts or fists. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The old man stood there in his flannel shirt and boots, the boy in a threadbare hoodie and 2 big jeans. "You planning on starting a hardware store?" Frank asked, voice even low. The boy didn't answer. Frank stepped further inside, letting the door swing gently closed behind him. He didn't slam it. He didn't trap the kid. He just made it clear that this space, his space, was no longer an open door in the night. "I said," Frank continued, "you planning on taking half my shop, or just the good stuff?" The boy's eyes darted toward the tool chest, then the door, measuring escape routes. Frank saw that calculation, the one a man makes when he's got no good choices. It was the kind of look Frank had seen in places far from home, in the faces of young men who had been asked to survive rather than live. "I wasn't going to take much," the boy said, voice hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in hours or maybe just wasn't used to being heard. "Just a few tools, stuff you wouldn't miss." "I notice everything," Frank replied. He let that settle between them for a beat. "Especially missing things." The boy lowered his hand slightly, the wrench dangling now, its threat gone. Frank didn't move closer. Instead, he nodded toward the backpack. "You zip that back up. Leave it right there. Then we talk." The boy hesitated, then slowly did as he was told. He zipped the pack and placed it on the floor near the workbench, his eyes never leaving Frank's. "I'm not going to call the cops," Frank said, reading the question before it was asked. "That what you're worried about?" "I don't care," the boy muttered, though his voice cracked on the word care. Frank gave a short shake of his head. "Sure you do, or you wouldn't have frozen like that when I walked in." The boy said nothing. Frank motioned toward the stool near the lathe. "Sit." The boy didn't move. "Your legs are shaking," Frank added, "either from cold or nerves, or both." Reluctantly, the boy moved to the stool and perched on it like a bird ready to take off at the first sudden motion. Frank crossed to his workbench, leaned against it, and folded his arms. "What's your name?" A pause. Then, "Does it matter?" "If you're gonna be in my shop, it does." The boy looked down. "Leo." Frank nodded. "All right, Leo." He didn't press for more. Not his last name. Not where he came from. The kid had already offered more than most would with that one word. Frank studied him, noticed the worn patches in his jeans, the bruising on his left wrist, half hidden under the hoodie sleeve. A red mark trailed up toward his elbow. Frank didn't ask about it. "You ever use a table saw?" he asked instead. Leo's brow furrowed. "What?" "You heard me." Leo shook his head. "Band saw? Drill press?" "No." "Then what were you planning on doing with my tools?" "I don't know," Leo said. "Sell 'em, maybe. Trade 'em." "For what?" "Does it matter?" Frank let the question hang, then nodded slowly. "It matters," he said. "But not tonight." Leo shifted on the stool, clearly waiting for the next step. The punishment, the speech, the escort to the door. Instead, Frank said, "You're not a good thief." Leo flinched, offended somehow. "I didn't get caught. You heard me." Frank gave a slow blink. "You got caught, and that makes you a bad thief. But you're quiet. That's something." Leo looked away. Frank stood there a moment longer, then made his decision. It came to him with the same certainty as the snap of a safety being flipped, the moment when training becomes instinct. He'd seen enough. And something about the boy's stance, the fight wrapped around his bones like armor, the silence that hung off him like wet clothesette, all felt too familiar to ignore. "If you're gonna steal," Frank said, "you're gonna learn how to use what you're taking." Leo looked up, confused. "What?" "I said, if you want my tools, you need to know what the hell they do. So, tomorrow, you come back, same time. I'll teach you how to use a hammer, a square, maybe even a plane if you prove you can follow directions." Leo narrowed his eyes. "You serious?" "Don't waste my time asking stupid questions," Frank replied. "I don't have much of it left." Leo stared at him like the old man had spoken in a foreign language. Then he stood up, slow, uncertain. "You want me to come back?" Frank nodded. "Why?" "Because right now you don't know a damn thing. And people who don't know things tend to break them. Tools, houses, lives." Leo looked down at his sneakers. One was untied. He didn't move to fix it. "I don't want a job," he muttered. "Good," Frank said. "I'm not offering one." He stepped forward and opened the door. The night air curled in around them. Leo picked up his backpack and slung it over one shoulder. He hesitated on the threshold. "You're weird," he said. Frank cracked the barest smile. "Takes one to know one." Leo left without another word. Frank stood in the doorway and watched the boy disappear down the side alley, a shadow folding into darkness. He waited until the night settled back into stillness, then turned and looked at his workshop. For the first time in a long while, the place felt like it had taken a breath. He walked to the stool where Leo had sat, ran his hand across the seat, then looked at the wrench still resting on the edge of the workbench. Leo had left it behind. Frank picked it up, turned it in his hand, and placed it carefully back in the drawer where it belonged. Then he closed the drawer, shut off the light, and walked out into the night with a strange feeling under his ribs, one that reminded him of anticipation, though he wasn't sure why. Leo showed up late. Frank had been standing by the back door with his second cup of coffee, the one he only made when he had something to wait for. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked past 5, then 10, then 20 minutes beyond the hour he had set in his head, and still there was no sound from the alley, no shadow on the side gate, no crunch of gravel from the boy's feet. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself it was just another kid making a mess and leaving it for someone else to clean up. The world was full of boys like that, and he had long since stopped chasing any of them. But he didn't pour out the coffee. He stayed by the window, trying to convince himself he wasn't doing exactly what he was doing. And when he finally gave up and started putting away the supplies he had laid out in the workshop, a measuring tape, a few scrap boards, a basic claw hammer, he heard the gate creak open. Leo didn't say anything. He slipped into the yard with his shoulders hunched and his hands jammed into the front pocket of his hoodie. His shoes were still untied, and he had a plastic grocery bag crumpled in one hand. He moved like someone who expected a punch, and Frank found himself almost angry at how familiar the posture looked. He didn't like recognizing pieces of his younger self in a boy who had clearly learned how to flinch before he learned how to speak with trust. Frank opened the workshop door without a word and stepped aside to let the kid in. Leo paused in the threshold, looking around like it might have been a trap after all. Then he followed. The smell of sawdust hit him first. Not fresh, not sharp, but deep and earthy, baked into the wood grain of the benches and floorboards. He ran his fingers over the edge of a shelf without touching anything, and Frank watched him carefully. There was still a twitch in the kid's stance, the instinct to grab and run. But there was also a flicker of curiosity he hadn't masked yet. That was something Frank could work with. "You're late," Frank said. Leo nodded, but didn't offer a reason. Frank didn't ask. Instead, he tapped the top of the workbench. "We start with the basics. Safety, respect, control. This place doesn't forgive mistakes. Tools don't care how old you are or what you've been through. They'll take a finger off if you're stupid." Leo's brow furrowed. "You gonna give me a lecture?" Frank gave a quiet grunt. "Only once." He reached under the bench and brought out a simple block of pine and a small handsaw. He placed both on the surface, then added a tape measure and a pencil. "You ever cut a straight line?" "On what?" "Anything." Leo shrugged. "I cut cardboard once." Frank handed him the pencil. "Mark 6 inches across the short edge, right in the center. Then draw a line." Leo hesitated, then took the pencil and tape measure. He fumbled with it, pulling too much out and letting it snap back with a metallic slap. Frank said nothing, just watched as the boy tried again. Slower this time, measuring, then pressing the pencil against the wood. The line was crooked, slanted toward the edge. Frank leaned in. "That's your cut line." Leo looked at it. "Yeah, cut it." He slid the handsaw toward him. Leo picked it up, examined the teeth like they might bite if he wasn't careful, then set it against the board. The first few strokes were awkward and shallow. The blade slipped. The angle was wrong. Frank reached out and adjusted his grip without warning, moving his hands with firm precision. "Let the saw do the work. Don't force it. Straight back and forth, smooth like breathing." Leo tried again, and this time the sound of the teeth in the wood had a rhythm to it, even if it was rough. After a few more passes, the saw slipped through the final inch, and the block dropped onto the bench with a soft thud. Leo looked down at the edge, not quite square. Frank nodded. Ugly, but honest. Leo cracked the faintest smile. They spent the next hour going over names of tools, Frank naming them with the same tone he used to list members of his old squad, each one with a purpose, each one with a story. Leo listened more than he spoke. He asked questions only when he didn't understand something, and even then, he tried to hide the fact that he cared. Frank didn't press. He explained how to use a square to check for 90 degrees, how to line up a nail without bending it, how to set a screw flush without splitting the wood. Leo's hands were quick once he got going, sloppy but eager. Frank could see the way he watched, memorized, repeated. The kid wasn't lazy, just untaught. At one point, Leo pulled out the plastic grocery bag. "Brought something," he mumbled, and pulled out a bent metal bracket and a small chunk of wood with 2 rusted screws half driven into it. Frank took it and examined the work. It was crude, but someone had tried to build a corner brace out of junk parts. "I was trying to fix a shelf," Leo said. "For my sister. It kept falling off the wall." "Did it hold?" "Only for a couple days." Frank walked to the far wall, pulled a bracket from an old bin, and held it up. "This one's better. I'll show you how to mount it properly next time." Leo nodded, but said nothing. His eyes lingered on the bin full of other odd parts. "You let her keep it even though it broke?" Frank asked after a minute. Leo shrugged. "She was proud of it. Said I built it myself." Frank didn't smile, but something in his expression softened. He returned to the bench and handed Leo a sanding block. "Keep working on the edges of that board you cut. Smooth it out. Make it clean." Leo took it and began sanding, the rasp of grit on pine filling the quiet. They didn't talk much after that. Frank showed him how to clamp a board, how to adjust the vise, how to label wood so you didn't waste cuts. Leo listened, absorbed. And for a brief hour in the cold light of the shop, the world outside stopped pressing in on both of them. The workshop, once dormant and stale, began to breathe again. Each movement, each correction, each mark of pencil on wood and scrape of blade on surface slowly built a rhythm, not fast or beautiful, but solid. As the sky outside began to shift toward dusk, Frank looked at the boy one last time before he left. Leo gave a brief nod before slipping out the door, quiet as he came. Frank didn't follow. He stood at the workbench, turned the freshly cut board in his hand, and felt its weight. It was imperfect. It had splinters, the line wasn't clean, and the cut had wavered. But it was made by someone learning, and that made it worth keeping. He placed it on a shelf near the door and turned off the light. The sound of his own footsteps on the wooden floor reminded him of days long past, when his workshop had been full of the clatter of hammers and the voice of purpose. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like an echo. It felt like a beginning. Frank wasn't sure what to expect the next time, but Leo arrived early. He was standing near the side gate when Frank stepped outside with his morning coffee. The boy didn't knock, didn't call out. He just stood there with his hood up, hands in his pockets, looking at the workshop like it might disappear if he blinked. Frank didn't say anything at first. He just unlocked the gate and held it open, and Leo passed through with the faintest nod of acknowledgement. The boy still moved like he didn't trust the ground, like every step might open a trapdoor beneath him. Inside the workshop, Frank had cleared space on the bench and laid out a small pile of offcuts, some with knots, others with clean grain. The table was cleaner than it had been in months. Leo noticed, but didn't mention it. He set his bag down in the same corner as before, like it had become routine already, and walked straight to the bench. Frank poured a second cup of coffee and handed Leo a thermos filled with hot cocoa. He didn't ask if the boy wanted it. He just placed it on the bench and went about checking the alignment on the drill press. Leo stared at the thermos for a long time before unscrewing the cap and taking a small sip. His shoulders relaxed slightly. Frank pointed to the pile of wood. "Today, you're going to learn how to make a box. Not for show, for function. I want tight corners, flush joints, nothing crooked. Leo ran a hand over the top piece of wood, testing its weight. What kind of box? Doesn't matter. Could be for nails, could be for secrets. Either way, it holds something, so it's worth building right. They started with measurements. Frank showed him how to plan each side, mark the boards, double-check lengths. Leo followed along, sometimes impatient, sometimes too fast, but he tried. When Frank corrected him, he didn't flinch like he had that first day. He still bristled a little, but there was less fight behind it. As they worked, the air filled with the smell of sawdust and the soft scrape of sandpaper. Frank showed him how to use the small block plane to smooth the edges, and Leo took to it with surprising focus. His hands, thin and wiry, guided the tool in long strokes, and curls of wood peeled away like shavings from an apple. Frank watched for a while in silence before offering a quiet nod of approval. Not bad. Leo glanced up quickly as if surprised by the praise, then went back to work without a word. It wasn't until an hour in that something shifted. Leo reached for a chisel with too much force and knocked a hammer off the table. It hit the concrete floor with a sharp clang. Frank turned sharply. Leo froze. His eyes went wide, the same expression Frank had seen in men cornered under fire, bracing for something they couldn't stop. Frank walked over and picked up the hammer without speaking. He placed it gently back on the table. "No big deal," he said. Leo didn't move. "I said it's fine," Frank repeated, softer. Leo's hands dropped to his sides. His face was pale, his mouth tight. Frank recognized the signs. It wasn't the hammer. It wasn't the mistake. It was everything behind the moment. The weight that came from expecting a hand to rise or a voice to explode. And when neither came, Leo didn't relax. He just looked confused. Frank turned away and busied himself with a drawer full of nails. He gave the boy time. After a while, Leo spoke. "Where'd you learn all this stuff?" Frank didn't answer right away. He pulled out a small box of screws and sorted them by length. "My father had a shop like this. Taught me when I was younger than you. Then I joined the army, picked up some more skills there, fixing things, rebuilding." "Rebuilding what?" "Everything," Frank said. "What the war didn't destroy, it left broken. We got good at trying to make things work again, mostly with spit and wire." Leo ran his hand along the grain of the board in front of him. "You were in a war?" Frank nodded. "Couple of them." Leo didn't ask which ones. He just said, "What was it like?" Frank set the screws down and leaned against the workbench. His eyes wandered to the window, where sunlight passed through the dust in long, lazy shafts. It was loud, hot, confusing, sometimes quiet in a way that made your skin crawl. You never knew when something was going to go wrong, and when it did, it happened fast. Leo watched him closely. "Did you? Did you ever get hurt?" "Not on the outside." That answer sat between them for a long time. Frank stood up again. "Let's finish this cut." They got back to work. Leo's box started to take shape. The cuts weren't perfect, and the corners needed some sanding to sit flush, but he was beginning to understand how each step led to the next. Frank handed him wood glue and clamps, showing him how to hold the sides in place while the adhesive set. When it was all pressed together, Leo stepped back and stared at it like he couldn't believe it had come from his own hands. "Ugly," he muttered. "But honest," Frank replied, and the boy smiled. They stayed in the workshop long past the time Frank usually stopped. The radio played low in the background, a voice murmuring about local weather and community updates. At one point, Frank offered Leo a sandwich, and the boy took it without hesitation this time. They ate in silence, seated at opposite ends of the bench like two mechanics sharing a break. As dusk began to roll in, Leo stood and picked up the box. He turned it over in his hands and then looked at Frank. "Can I give it to my sister?" Frank nodded. "That's what it's for." Leo hesitated. "She keeps her drawings in a shoebox. Maybe this one'll last longer. Frank didn't ask about the sister. He didn't need to. He just watched the way Leo's voice softened when he said her name, like the only good thing in his life lived in her shadow. When the boy left that evening, he carried the box carefully in both hands, pressed against his chest. Frank watched him disappear down the alley again, his posture straighter than before, the edge in his stride replaced with something more grounded. The workshop felt different once he was gone. Not full, exactly, but not empty either. The scent of wood still lingered, and the tools were back in their places, but something invisible had been left behind. Frank looked at the workbench, where a small smear of glue still marked the spot where the box had been assembled, and he let his fingers rest on the surface for a moment. He hadn't thought about his father's shop in years. Not the sound of the old belt sander, not the way his father would hum out of tune while sharpening blades. Those memories had grown dull in the years since he came home, buried under sand and gunfire and too many funerals. But something about the boy had stirred them up. Something raw, something incomplete. Maybe the act of building again had brought it all back. He turned off the light, closed the door, and stood for a while in the backyard, watching the last of the sunlight disappear behind the rooftops. There was something new in the air, something restless and unfinished but not unwelcome. He found himself wondering if the boy would come back tomorrow, and for the first time in a long while, the thought of someone returning didn't feel like a threat. It felt like hope. Frank woke the next morning with the feeling that something was off. The sky outside his bedroom window was overcast, but the light had already settled into the yard. He had expected to see Leo's narrow frame at the edge of the fence, or hear the faint creak of the gate latch just after sunrise, the way he had for the past few mornings. Instead, the yard was still. The workshop remained quiet. The silence pressed on Frank more than usual, like a weight in the air that hadn't been there yesterday. He kept busy for the first hour, telling himself it didn't matter. He cleaned out the ash from the wood stove in the corner of the shop, restacked the scrap bin, oiled the hinge on the tool chest lid. By mid-morning, there was still no sign of Leo, and Frank had stopped pretending he wasn't checking the window every few minutes. The thermos of hot cocoa sat untouched on the bench where Leo usually dropped his bag. Frank hadn't realized he'd filled it out of habit until he found himself unscrewing the lid and emptying it into the sink with a muttered curse. He went back to the kitchen and sat at the table with a crossword puzzle, but his mind kept drifting. He kept seeing the look in Leo's eyes when he talked about his sister, the guarded pride in his voice when he held up that rough little box like it meant something more than wood and glue. It wasn't just about the project. It was never just the thing being built. Frank had spent years trying to explain that to people who didn't listen, who wanted results but never cared about the process. It was past noon when Frank stepped out onto the porch again and lit a cigarette he hadn't planned on smoking. He had cut down to 1 or 2 a day, sometimes none, but today the itch had returned. As he exhaled, he saw movement down the block. A boy on a bike sped past, but it wasn't Leo. A woman walked a dog. A delivery truck rolled by. None of them mattered. Frank went back inside, closed the door more forcefully than needed, and sat in the dark workshop with the lights off. The dust motes spun in the gray light, filtering through the window, and the smell of pine and oil seemed sharper without any sound to soften it. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't open the drawer where he kept the unfinished plans for the tool rack Leo had asked about. Instead, he waited. Leo didn't come that day, or the next. Frank didn't call anyone. He didn't know who he would call even if he wanted to. He didn't have Leo's last name. He didn't know what school he went to, what neighborhood he slept in, or what system had placed him wherever he was. He only knew the kid had started showing up, and now he wasn't. On the 3rd day, Frank finally asked around. He walked down the block to where the Mendez family always left their garage open and said hello to the oldest son, Manny, who was washing his car. Manny was 16, 2 years older than Leo looked, and he recognized the description. "Yeah," Manny said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I think I've seen that kid. Comes through sometimes after school. keeps his head down, doesn't talk much. You know where he lives?" Manny hesitated, then shook his head. "No, but I think he stays over near the Redmond duplexes, the yellow ones with the busted fence." Frank didn't ask any more questions. He thanked Manny and walked back to his house without looking around. That evening, when the sun was just beginning to drop behind the houses, Frank drove out to the Redmond complex and parked across the street. He didn't get out of the truck right away. The buildings looked tired. Paint peeled off in sheets, a broken swing hung from a rusted frame in the front yard, and someone had thrown a plastic chair onto the roof of one of the units. Kids darted in and out of doorways, but none of them looked like Leo. Frank stayed in the truck until it was nearly dark, hoping to catch a glimpse, some confirmation that Leo hadn't just vanished into the city's cracks. He was about to give up when he saw a girl step out of one of the units with a plastic grocery bag and walk to the trash bins. She looked about 10, with hair tied back in 2 messy braids. She paused at the bin, looked around cautiously, and then dumped the bag. As she turned back toward the building, Frank recognized the way she walked, the way her arms curled slightly at her sides, not from habit but from the tension of someone who never quite let their guard down. He opened the door and stepped out. "Excuse me," he said. The girl froze. Her eyes locked on him, and he saw the same suspicion, the same distrust Leo had carried on his first night in the shop. "I'm looking for Leo," Frank said. She didn't respond. "I'm not a cop. I'm not here to cause trouble. I think he was supposed to be somewhere, and he didn't show." Her voice was thin and careful. "You're the old guy with the workshop." Frank nodded. "That's right." She looked down at the ground, then back at the door behind her. "He got in trouble." Frank's jaw tightened. "What kind?" She didn't answer right away. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "The guy we live with got mad. Leo tried to stop him. He hit Leo. Then the cops came." Frank felt something cold settle in his chest. "Where is he now?" he asked. "I don't know. They took him somewhere else. A different house, I think. They didn't tell me." "Did anyone tell you if he was okay?" She looked away. He didn't look okay. Frank didn't ask her anything else. He just nodded and thanked her. Then he returned to his truck and sat with his hands on the wheel, unmoving. The girl had already gone inside by the time he started the engine. That night, the workshop stayed dark. Frank sat at the bench, staring at the rough sketch Leo had left behind on a scrap of paper, a plan for a treehouse that was half fantasy, half structural nightmare. There were drawings of rope ladders and secret compartments, and a little box labeled "Sister's Spot" next to the window. Frank didn't sleep well. He kept thinking of bruises half hidden under sleeves, of tense shoulders and flinches that had nothing to do with him. He thought of how quickly the boy had trusted him, how easily it had all been taken away. The next morning, Frank called someone he hadn't spoken to in years, a woman from the local Veterans Resource Office who helped connect former soldiers with outreach programs. He asked her what it took to find a kid in the system, a foster kid. She asked questions he didn't know how to answer. She asked if he had ever considered taking someone in. Frank didn't lie. He told her he hadn't, not seriously, not until now. The woman on the other end paused, then said she'd make some calls. Frank hung up and walked back into the workshop. He pulled out a new board from the stack and clamped it to the table. He started cutting, slow and steady, following the lines Leo had drawn. Not because the treehouse would ever be built exactly as it was sketched, but because it mattered that someone started. The next few days moved with the slow weight of waiting. Frank stayed busy in the workshop, working on pieces of Leo's plan, one board at a time, not knowing if the boy would ever see them. He had tacked Leo's sketch to the wall near the light switch. The pencil lines were smudged and uneven, corners curled slightly from the handling, but Frank treated it like a blueprint handed down from someone important. It wasn't about the treehouse, not really. It was about continuing something that had been started. He worked quietly, carving joists and bracing segments out of salvaged lumber from a demolition site a few blocks over. He stripped nails from boards that still had rust on them and planed surfaces until they were clean and square. It wasn't fast work, but it was honest. The kind of work that felt right in the hands, even when the heart wasn't sure what it was building toward. Every now and then, he'd glance at the door, half expecting Leo to walk through it, cock his head at the stack of boards, and start asking too many questions all at once. Instead, the days passed without him. It wasn't until late on a Thursday afternoon that Frank heard a voice outside, and not one he recognized. He was working with the radial saw at the time, and the sound of the blade drowned out most things, but something about the sharpness of the tone cut through. He powered down the saw and stepped outside. A man in a city maintenance vest stood on the edge of Frank's driveway, clipboard in hand, arguing with a neighbor across the fence. Frank caught the tail end of it, something about wood scraps, visible piles, and safety regulations. The neighbor waved the man off and nodded toward Frank's yard. "You want complaints?" the man said, half laughing. "Check that guy's backyard." Frank stepped up before the inspector could wander further. "I'm the guy," he said simply. The man looked up from his clipboard, startled. "Oh, sorry," he said, smoothing his tone. "Didn't know anyone was out here. Just checking up on some reports about debris and materials piling up along the alley. Someone flagged it last week." Frank folded his arms and tilted his head. "It's reclaimed lumber. Nothing dangerous. Neatly stacked. Still needs to be moved or organized. City's got limits on what you can store outside." Frank didn't reply. He knew the rule, but no one had ever enforced it before. Not for scraps of wood. Not in this part of the neighborhood. The inspector shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I'm just doing my job. If you've got a project going, fine. Just tidy it up or move it inside." Frank let him finish before nodding once. "It'll be gone by Sunday." The man thanked him and walked off, without further comment. Frank turned back toward the alley and glanced at the pile of lumber. It was no worse than usual, no more of an eyesore than the broken-down fence 2 houses over or the chain-link gate someone had covered with a stained bedsheet. But it stuck out because something about his place had changed. Someone had noticed it, and people only noticed when there was movement. That night, Frank made a phone call to the man who ran the local salvage yard. He arranged to have a few planks dropped off the next day clean, pressure-treated, the kind of wood that could stand up to wind and time. He told himself it was just to keep busy, but deep down, he knew it was preparation. He had built things alone before, but this felt different. He was building space, a structure meant to hold more than just weight. Friday morning, he began assembling the foundation. The treehouse couldn't go up in a tree, not the way Leo had drawn it. The big maple in the yard wasn't strong enough, and Frank had no interest in seeing a child fall from 10 feet up. Instead, he adjusted the design, kept the proportions, but mounted the platform on a 4-post system. It would look like a treehouse. It would feel like one. But it would be safe. It would stand. He started by clearing the patch of lawn near the back corner of the yard. The soil was dry and cracked, so he had to work harder to level the ground. He dug holes for the posts by hand. It took most of the morning, and he sweat through his shirt twice, but he didn't stop. As he worked, people walked by. A woman pushing a stroller slowed down to watch. 2 boys on scooters stopped on the sidewalk and whispered to each other before moving on. Later that afternoon, one of Frank's neighbors, a man named Cliff, who lived 2 houses down, walked over with a beer in his hand and nodded at the lumber. "You building something?" he asked. Frank straightened up and wiped his brow. "Treehouse." Cliff glanced around. "You got grandkids?" Frank shook his head. "Not mine." Cliff didn't press. "You need a hand?" Frank hesitated. He wasn't used to taking help, but he remembered the way Leo had stared at the treehouse sketch like it could save something, and he nodded. By the next morning, word had gotten around. Another neighbor showed up, a retired electrician who offered to rig a small solar-powered light for the interior. A teenager with a skateboard asked if he could help paint it once it was done. Someone donated a roll of insulation batting and 2 small windows from an old RV. The materials weren't fancy, the cuts weren't perfect, but the pieces came together faster than Frank expected. He kept Leo's sketch tacked on the wall and brought it outside each day, clipping it to a board with a clothespin as they worked. Everyone who came to help saw it. Some asked who drew it. Frank never gave a full answer. He just said, "Kid I'm hoping comes back." The platform took shape by Sunday. 4 beams rose from the ground, framed with cross bracing and decked with 2x6s. The walls started going up next, panel by panel, with gaps for the small windows. The roof would be angled. The ladder would be rope and wood rungs, same as Leo's design, but with added safety tethers Frank planned to secure once it was finished. By midweek, the shape of the treehouse could be seen from the street. People passing by started asking questions. Some dropped off extra screws or water bottles. Someone brought over a box of granola bars with a note taped to the top that said, "For the builder, whenever he comes home." Frank kept working, even when the light began to fade. He installed a small shelf under the window marked Sister's Spot and added a nameplate made of scrap metal. He didn't stamp it with anything. Not yet. But he stared at it long after the others had gone home for the evening. He thought about Leo's hands, calloused from too many wrong tools, and the way he'd held that first rough box like it was a sacred thing. He thought about the girl, her braids, the quiet fear in her voice when she said her brother didn't look okay. He thought about the system, how it scattered kids like seeds into places where most didn't grow. And then he looked at the half-finished walls and the platform beneath them. And he knew one thing. Someone had to build something that could hold them up, even if it was just one small place. Even if it didn't fix everything. Even if it just gave them somewhere to breathe. The workshop was warm with the scent of pine and the low, rhythmic thump of a hammer when the knock came. Frank didn't hear it at first. He was crouched on the floor, fitting the last baseboard into the platform frame. The treehouse was nearly done. A few more panels, some finishing nails, and then it would be ready for paint and sealant. He was planning to call Cliff and the others later that afternoon, get help lifting the final wall into place. He had even written Leo's name in pencil on the underside of one of the beams, just his first name. A small thing, a quiet hope. The second knock came harder. Not frantic, but firm enough to break through his focus. Frank set the hammer down and wiped his hands on a rag before stepping out into the yard. At the front gate stood a woman in a worn gray sweater and jeans that were soaked at the ankles. Her hair was pulled back, and she carried a large black purse that she gripped tightly with both hands. Her eyes scanned the yard, landed on Frank, then on the half-finished treehouse behind him. "You Frank Delaney?" she asked. Frank nodded once. "That's right." "I'm with Family and Youth Services," she said, flashing a badge from the front pocket of her bag. "My name's Janice. I'm Leo's caseworker." Frank's back stiffened. The woman's expression wasn't cold, but it was tired. She looked like someone who had been answering the same questions for weeks and was already bracing for the next round. "He's okay," she added quickly, reading his face. "Physically. A little bruised, but no fractures, no stitches. He's in a temporary shelter for minors, one of our emergency group homes." Frank crossed his arms. "Why are you here?" Janice let out a quiet breath and stepped closer to the gate. She didn't come in. She just looked past him at the treehouse. "Leo's been asking about you. Won't talk to most of the staff, won't eat much either, but he keeps asking when he can go back to the workshop." Frank felt something shift in his chest. He turned slightly, glancing at the structure behind him. "He can't stay there," Janice said gently. "Not without some paperwork in place. You know how the system works." "I don't," Frank said. "Not really." "Well," Janice replied. "Then I'll tell you. Leo's been in and out of placement since he was 9. More homes than I can count. Most people don't keep him for more than a couple months. He's sharp, doesn't trust anyone, picks fights. But he's got a sister, and she's the only reason he doesn't bolt every time we move him. He stays for her." I met her, Frank said. Briefly. Janice nodded. Yeah. Ellie. She's younger, quieter. They've been in the same home 3 times now, separated twice. We're trying not to do that again. Right now, she's still with her last foster parent, but it's complicated. Frank narrowed his eyes. Complicated how? There was a domestic call, she said. You probably heard. Leo got in the middle of it, protected her, but that means he broke placement rules, fought back. Technically assaulted someone, even if that someone was an adult who had no business laying hands on anybody. We're trying to keep charges off the table, but it's a mess. Frank looked down at his hands. A sliver of wood was embedded in his thumb, but he hadn't noticed until now. He pulled it free slowly. What happens to him? If no one steps in? Janice asked. He stays in the system. We try to find another placement, probably in another district. Maybe a group home. Maybe a new foster situation if we're lucky. He turns 16 in a year and a half. Most kids that age just age out. He won't say it, but he's expecting it. He's planning on it. Frank didn't answer. I know this is a lot, Janice said. I'm not here to pressure you. He just kept talking about you, about the shop, about the treehouse. She paused and finally opened the gate. When Frank didn't stop her, she stepped inside and walked over to the base of the wooden platform. She placed a hand on the beam and tilted her head up, eyes scanning the unfinished roofline. He said it was for Ellie, she said. Said she always wanted a place where the floor didn't creak when someone angry walked past. Frank looked at her, really looked at her, and saw she wasn't just doing a job. She was carrying stories, the kind that wear down a person one child at a time. And yet, she hadn't stopped caring. He respected that. What are the steps? He asked quietly. Janice turned. For what? For making sure he doesn't get sent somewhere else. She hesitated. You want to take him in? I want him back in the shop, Frank said. If I have to fill out paperwork to make that happen, I'll do it. Janice nodded. It's not easy, but it's possible. You'd have to pass background checks, home visit, training, interviews, and you'd have to be willing to take him in officially, not just let him work here. I was in the military for 22 years, Frank said. Never had a record, never missed a check. This house is quiet, stable, and no one comes in or out who shouldn't. He won't be in danger here. That's a start, she said. But he's not a guest. If this moves forward, he'll be your responsibility. All of him. Not just the parts that know how to use a handsaw. Frank didn't flinch. I've seen worse than temper tantrums. Janice took a business card from her bag and handed it to him. Then let's schedule the first visit. He held the card between his fingers after she left. He didn't go back into the workshop. Instead, he sat at the base of the treehouse, looking up at the beams that still needed siding, the gap where the last window would go. The late afternoon sun filtered through the skeletal frame, casting a crisscross of shadows on the grass. The next morning, Frank swept the house clean from top to bottom. He aired out the guest room, washed the sheets, cleared space in the hallway closet. He fixed the bathroom door that had a sticky latch and replaced the chipped tile on the kitchen floor. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. 3 days later, Leo showed up at the gate with a paper bag and the same guarded stare he had worn the first night Frank caught him stealing tools. This time, a caseworker waited across the street in a parked car. Leo didn't move until Frank stepped forward and pulled the gate open. You coming in? Frank asked. Leo shrugged. Depends. On what? Leo looked up at the treehouse, which now had a roof and siding, and a small weather vane spinning slowly at the top. His eyes lingered on it. Did you really build that? He asked. Frank nodded. Used your sketch. Leo stepped forward, then paused again. Why? Because you started it. They stood there for a moment, the air thick with all the things neither one was good at saying. Finally, Leo stepped through the gate. You got anything to eat? Frank motioned toward the kitchen door. Grilled cheese or peanut butter. Leo grinned. Grilled cheese. Frank didn't smile back, but something in his chest loosened. Something that hadn't breathed fully in a long, long time. They walked inside together. The shop could wait. The treehouse would still be there tomorrow, but right now, the boy was home. The house was too quiet that first night. Leo didn't say much after dinner, and Frank didn't press him. The boy ate quickly, scraping every last crumb off his plate like he wasn't sure when the next meal would come. He drank 2 glasses of milk and barely looked up, his shoulders tense, eyes darting between the kitchen and the hallway like he was still trying to map the escape routes. When Frank offered to show him the guest room, Leo just nodded, picked up his paper bag, and followed without a word. The room was small, but clean. Frank had made the bed with fresh sheets and stacked a couple of clean towels at the foot. The closet door was open, showing hangers and a single shelf with a folded blanket. Leo stepped inside, looked around once, then sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. Frank didn't linger. He just said goodnight and left the door cracked in case the boy wanted it that way. He didn't turn on the TV that night, didn't put on the radio. Instead, he sat in his armchair with a book open on his lap and a mug cooling on the table beside him. But he didn't read, and he didn't drink. He just listened. The creak of the guest room floor, the faint thump of a drawer opening, the sound of a boy trying to settle into a place that didn't feel temporary yet. The morning came with the smell of toast and eggs. Frank moved slowly in the kitchen, giving Leo time to wake on his own. He didn't call for him. He didn't knock. Around 7:30, the door creaked open, and Leo shuffled in, hair a mess, eyes heavy with sleep. He didn't speak at first. He just dropped into the kitchen chair and reached for a fork. Frank watched him eat. It wasn't just hunger. It was the kind of eating that came from always being prepared to finish fast, just in case. "You sleep?" Frank asked. Leo gave a slight shrug. "Kind of." "You need more blankets?" It was fine. Frank let it go. After breakfast, they went out to the workshop together. The air was crisp and dry, and the sky was clear. The treehouse stood like a quiet promise near the back fence, its weathered lumber catching the early light. Leo stood and looked at it for a long time before walking over to the ladder and testing the first rung with his foot. Frank waited as the boy climbed slowly to the platform and stood in the small space they had framed together. The inside still smelled like fresh wood. The windows let in soft streaks of light. Frank had left a pencil and notebook on the shelf marked for Ellie. Leo looked around, then sat down against the far wall, knees pulled up. Frank could see the way his hands moved across the floorboards, checking the seams, testing the give of the structure. He was quiet for several minutes. Then he said, "You built this fast." "I had help." Leo nodded slowly. "It's strong." That was the idea. They spent the morning in the shop, sanding the last of the trim pieces and cutting a panel for the treehouse door. Frank worked at one end of the bench while Leo took the other. They didn't talk much. The radio played low, some old jazz station that came through with just enough clarity to keep things from feeling too still. Around midday, Frank made sandwiches, and they ate in the shade of the treehouse, sitting on the grass. Leo took his time this time, chewing slower, leaning back on his elbows. "I had a room once," he said suddenly. "Back when I was 7, with real furniture, a poster on the wall. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I stayed there for 8 months. That was the longest." Frank didn't respond. He knew that kind of memory, the kind that sticks because it was brief and decent and out of reach for too long afterward. "I didn't pack anything," Leo added. "When they took me this last time, just grabbed my sister's box and left my stuff." Frank looked over. "You still have it?" Leo nodded. "It's in the paper bag." "You want to build her another one?" Leo glanced toward the workshop. "I want to build something better." The next few days followed a rhythm that neither of them commented on. Frank woke early, made coffee and breakfast, and Leo slowly adjusted to waking without fear of being told to leave. He started to use the bathroom without closing the door all the way, started wearing slippers Frank found in the garage, started leaving his jacket on the hook by the back door instead of clutching it through every meal. He moved like someone who was learning not to expect an alarm. They kept working on projects, fixed the toaster that hadn't popped right in 2 years, repaired the screen door that had been off its track since the fall, built a small wooden toolbox for Leo to keep his personal tools, which Frank labeled with small strips of tape and blocky handwriting. Leo even offered to clean the gutters, though Frank refused and made him hold the ladder instead. One afternoon, Leo came in from the workshop and found Frank sitting at the table with a large folder and a stack of forms spread out in front of him. The boy didn't say anything, but Frank could feel his presence. He looked up slowly. "They want references," Frank said, tapping the form. "Letters, a home inspection, interviews." Leo leaned against the doorframe. "That for me?" Frank nodded. "They don't just let someone walk in and say they want to keep a kid around." Leo looked away. "You don't have to do all that." Frank didn't answer right away. He set the pen down and folded his hands. "I do if I want it to last." Leo looked at him then. Really looked. "You think it will?" "I think it can." It was the closest either of them had come to saying it out loud, that the workshop wasn't just a place to pass time, that the house wasn't just a roof, that this thing between them, however fragile, was starting to take shape like the walls of the treehouse, one plank at a time. That night, Frank turned off the radio early and sat in his chair by the window. He could hear the soft sound of Leo moving around in the guest room, a drawer opening, the thump of a backpack being set down. Then silence. Frank looked out into the yard, where the treehouse stood, silhouetted against the stars. He thought of all the nights he had spent waiting for a sound that never came, and now there was a different kind of quiet, one that didn't ache the same way. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was close. The day they finished the treehouse, the neighborhood came alive. It started early, with the sound of hammers tapping and wood shifting under boots. Cliff arrived with a fresh box of screws and a thermos full of coffee he insisted was stronger than engine oil. Manny, the teenager from down the block, showed up with his younger cousin and a set of paintbrushes he'd borrowed from school. Frank had tried to say no to paint at first, thinking the bare wood had a clean dignity to it, but Leo had stared at the treehouse for a long time, then said that if it was meant to feel like hers, then it should look like her drawings, bright colors, stars, a purple door. Frank hadn't argued. By mid-morning, the yard was full. People came by in a slow trickle, neighbors who had seen the thing take shape and wanted to know what it was about. Some brought paint cans and drop cloths. Others carried water bottles and snacks. One woman brought a battery-powered speaker and set it on the porch steps, playing soft music while the younger kids danced around the edges of the lawn. It felt like something between a block party and a barn raising, the kind of gathering that didn't get planned so much as willed into existence. Leo worked the whole day. He didn't stop for long, didn't drift away or hang back like he used to. He climbed the ladder with a drill holstered on his hip like a cowboy, helped paint stars across the ceiling beams, and handed screws to a girl half his age without saying a word. Frank watched him from the porch and felt something in his chest settle, like the weight of everything he'd been holding on to had finally shifted. The treehouse was done by late afternoon. The roof was patched, the trim painted in bright teal, and the purple door hung square on its hinges. Inside, they laid down a folded blanket and 2 pillows, one striped and one plain. Leo placed a small tin box under the window and labeled it in pencil. Ellie's Spot. Frank didn't say anything. He just ran his hand along the outside wall and nodded once. As people began to pack up, Cliff clapped Frank on the shoulder and said, "You ever think this thing would pull people together?" Frank looked around. At the kids chasing each other across the lawn, at the neighbors talking in pairs, at the treehouse catching the last light of the sun. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't." Later that evening, after the yard had emptied and the tools were back in their places, Frank stood at the base of the treehouse with Leo beside him. The boy was quiet again, not withdrawn, just full. The kind of silence that comes when there's too much inside to pour out all at once. "She's gonna like it," Leo said finally. She always wanted something of her own. Frank looked up at the purple door, at the windows with painted stars around the frame. "You gave her something no one else ever could." Leo nodded. "Yeah, but it won't matter if they move her." Frank had no answer to that. The system moved slowly, sometimes painfully so. His paperwork was still crawling through the chain of approvals, and there was no guarantee anything would work out the way he hoped. But he couldn't lie. Not to Leo. "I'm trying," he said. Leo nodded again. "I know." 2 days later, a local reporter showed up at the gate. She said she'd heard about the treehouse from someone at City Hall, something about a veteran who'd built a safe space for foster kids. Frank tried to wave her off, said it wasn't a story, just a project. But Leo stepped forward and said it was fine. He didn't want to be on camera, but he agreed to talk, quietly, off to the side, while the woman scribbled notes in her pad. He told her about building it for Ellie, how the wood was all scrap, how the colors were hers, how the idea had come from a sketch on the back of a math worksheet. He told her about the workshop, how Frank didn't yell or make promises, how the first thing he learned to do was cut a crooked piece of pine and make something useful from it. Frank didn't say much during the interview. He didn't need to. The article ran in the Sunday edition under the headline, "War Vet Builds Treehouse and a Second Chance for Foster Kid." There was a picture of the treehouse, bright in the morning sun, and a short quote from Leo that read, "It's not just wood. It's what I didn't have before." Frank didn't clip the article, but someone left a copy on his porch in a plastic sleeve, and it sat for a while on the workbench, untouched. That same week, the foster care office called. Janice, the caseworker, said the adoption inquiry was moving faster than expected. There was a tension now, pressure from people who had read the article and wanted to see it go somewhere. Frank didn't know how to feel about that. He didn't build the treehouse for a headline. He built it because the kid came back. But the next call came from Ellie's placement supervisor. They wanted to arrange a visit. Frank stood in the kitchen with the phone pressed to his ear, and the woman on the other end said the girl had been asking if she could see the place Leo talked about. The place with stars on the walls and a door that was hers. They scheduled it for a Saturday. The day was clear and warm, unusual for the season. Frank and Leo cleaned the house that morning, sweeping corners, straightening cushions, setting out a pitcher of lemonade that Leo insisted needed twice as much sugar. When the car pulled up in front of the house, Leo stood by the window and didn't move until the door opened. Ellie stepped out slowly. She wore a faded pink sweatshirt and jeans with one knee ripped. Her hair was braided the same way as before. She looked smaller than Frank remembered. She carried nothing. The caseworker walked her to the gate, but Ellie didn't wait. She slipped through as soon as it opened and ran straight to Leo, wrapping her arms around his middle so tightly he staggered back a step. He didn't hug her right away. He just stood there with his arms at his sides, staring down at the top of her head. Then slowly, he wrapped his arms around her and held on. She didn't say anything for a long time, just cried. Later, when she had calmed and the three of them sat on the porch steps with lemonade and cookies, Ellie asked if she could see the treehouse. Leo took her hand and led her across the yard, pointing out each detail, the stars, the shelf, the small metal tin under the window. Frank stayed on the porch and watched as she climbed the ladder with care, as she stepped into the little house like it was something sacred. She sat by the window, looked down at the tin, and smiled. "I like it here," she said. Frank felt something twist in his chest, something fierce and protective. He didn't know what would happen next. The system was large, and people got lost in it every day. But for that moment, the girl was safe, and the boy was steady, and the house and the tree stood strong around them. It wasn't everything, but it was theirs. Years later, the workshop still smelled like sawdust. Leo stood in the doorway with the sunlight warming his back and looked across the room where it had all begun. The old bench was still there, worn smooth at the edges, the same vise clamped to the far corner. Dust motes drifted lazily in the shafts of light coming through the windows, floating past jars of nails and boxes of scrap wood stacked just high enough to suggest someone had been working recently. The radio was off, but it was still there, sitting in its same corner on the shelf. The dial hadn't moved. He walked inside slowly, his boots scuffing the familiar floor, and rested his hand on the workbench. The grooves in the wood felt deeper now. Time had carved into the grain, into every corner of the room, but nothing essential had changed. The tools still hung in careful rows. The smell of oil and pine still clung to the air. He felt like he had walked into the pages of a memory that had been waiting to be reopened. Outside, a breeze rustled the leaves of the big maple tree. He could hear Ellie laughing in the yard, the sound light and easy as it rose above the hum of young voices. She was showing the treehouse to a new kid, one of the younger ones who had come to stay just a few weeks earlier. Leo glanced toward the open door and caught a glimpse of her braids swinging behind her as she climbed up the ladder. Her feet were bare. She hadn't worn shoes around the yard in years. Leo smiled and turned back to the bench. On the shelf above it sat the first box he ever made, the one Frank had refused to throw out even when Leo offered to build something better. It was crooked, one side slightly shorter than the other, and the nails didn't sit flush, but it had been the first thing, the start of everything. Frank had called it honest. Leo lifted the box in both hands and set it gently on the bench. He ran his fingers along the edge, tracing the place where the glue had bled out and dried. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded letter. The paper was creased and soft with age. The handwriting on the front was blocky and deliberate. He had read it enough times to know the words by heart, but today he unfolded it again and laid it flat on the bench. It had come in the mail 5 months ago, just before the service. Frank had written it sometime the year before, after the diagnosis, but before the hospital visits started. He hadn't said anything at the time. Typical. Quiet and steady to the end. The letter wasn't long. It said only what mattered. You build things. You fix what others throw away. That's not something I taught you. That's something you already had. I just gave you space to find it. If you're reading this, it means you stayed. Thank you for staying. Keep the shop alive. Below the signature, Frank had drawn a tiny chisel. It was the same one he had used to teach Leo how to cut dovetails. The blade was still on the pegboard behind the bench. Leo stood there with the letter spread out, the old box beside it, and listened to the silence. It was not empty now, not lonely. It was full in the way old homes sometimes are, full of echoes and warmth and presence. Frank wasn't there, but he hadn't left. He had become part of the place, folded into the wood and the light and the dust on the windowsill. There was a knock at the open door. Leo turned and saw Ellie leaning inside, one foot still on the porch, her hair wild from the wind. "They're ready," she said. "You promised to show Mikey how to use the hand drill." Leo nodded. "I'll be there in a second." She didn't leave right away. Her eyes fell on the box and the letter. "You going to tell him?" she asked. "About Frank?" She nodded. "Yeah," Leo said. "I will." She smiled and stepped back outside, her silhouette framed in the fading gold light of late afternoon. Leo picked up the letter and tucked it carefully into the box. Then he carried both to the small shelf near the door and placed them beside the radio. On the way out, he paused to grab the old hand drill from the wall. The handle was worn smooth, the chuck still tight. It was the first tool Frank had let him use alone. Outside, the yard had changed. It had grown, like everything else. The fence had been replaced, the lawn cleaner, more open. The treehouse still stood at the back corner. Its paint faded now, but its frame still strong. There were new touches, too. A rope swing, a row of sunflowers, a little bench, that one of the girls had built last fall under Leo's guidance. A small group of kids gathered near the base of the treehouse, all of them wide-eyed and messy-haired, most of them carrying the weight of stories they hadn't yet figured out how to tell. Mikey stood off to one side, a lanky 10-year-old with big hands and sharp eyes. He was watching the others with quiet interest, the same way Leo used to. Leo walked over and crouched in front of him. "You ever use one of these?" he asked, holding up the drill. Mikey shook his head. Leo handed it to him, carefully guiding his fingers to the right places. "You don't have to force it. Let it work. Keep your pressure steady, like this." He pressed a scrap of wood into the ground and set the drill against it. Mikey watched, wide-eyed, as the bit bit down into the wood and began to turn. Leo passed the drill over and let the boy try. The other kids circled around. Ellie sat on the edge of the porch, her knees pulled up, a book open in her lap. The wind lifted strands of her hair, and for a second, Leo saw the girl she had been quiet, watching, waiting, and the woman she was becoming. Mikey finished the hole and looked up. "Did I do it right?" Leo nodded. "You did." The boy grinned and started another. Leo stood back and watched. The sky had begun to darken at the edges, the kind of blue that meant evening was near. Somewhere in the distance, someone's sprinkler kicked on, and the soft click-click of water hitting pavement mixed with the chatter of the kids and the creak of the treehouse in the breeze. Frank had once told him that building things wasn't about perfection. It was about holding the pieces together long enough for them to matter, long enough for someone to call it theirs. Leo understood that now. He glanced back at the workshop. The windows caught the last light and glowed faintly. Tomorrow he'd fix the squeaky cabinet in the kitchen. After that, maybe the hinges on the front door. There was always something to work on, always something to build. But for now, this was enough. The yard was full. The house was steady. The shop was alive.